hello everyone, and congratulations on sticking around for the second half of the evening. I know it's getting late and people are probably a bit postprandial now and drowsy, so respect. So I chose this title, To Infinity and Beyond, because I wanted to convey sort of an idea of the scope of the changes that we're seeing in this area and the speed with which this area is changing. So that's sort of the theme of my talk. Before I start, I just want to thank Diabetes SA for asking me to speak to you all this evening, and hopefully I don't bore you all to sleep. I have no disclosures, and I should say that I'm not promoting or detracting from any of the products that I will be mentioning tonight. Of course, in a talk on technology, there's going to be lots of talk about companies. So I'm not advocating for anything in particular or detracting from any of them, but I'll just be trying to present sort of an unbiased perspective on what's available now. So this slide is really to just demonstrate that the way we treat diabetes and the way we think about diabetes targets is shifting. It used to be in the post-large DCCT trials that the tighter your glucose control in every single patient, the better. But we are sort of starting to shift away from that slightly. We know that in some patients, really tight glycemic control or very tight glucose control is not always the most appropriate thing. So this is sort of following on from what Toby said in his talk, that we really need to tailor our targets to the individual. And this is a sort of recommended pro forma of how we try and decide how tight the control should be in a given patient. So it depends on how long you've had diabetes, whether you've got complications, whether you have other diseases that are of bigger or greater concern. So it's really not HbA1c of 6% for everyone anymore. We know that that's not safe in all individuals. Obviously, the focus of this talk is type 1 diabetes, and for the most part, these are patients will be aiming for tight control if we're recommending technologies, but it's not always the case. And something that we're sort of moving towards, specifically with these technology advances, is away from just thinking about HbA1c and thinking about something called time in range, which is the TIR, and that's sort of a new way of assessing overall glycemic control, because we know that glycated hemoglobin or HbA1c is not perfect. It can be altered or inaccurate in patients with anemia or kidney disease or abnormalities of their red cells. So even in someone with an identical HbA1c to the person sitting next to them, it doesn't actually mean that we know they've got the same glycemic control. So one of the things that they're suggesting we look at is time in range, i.e. time in target glucose levels, so not just HbA1c. And this slide is to demonstrate that for an estimated time in range, so say 70%, which is pretty good, which equates round about to an HbA1c of 6.8%, you can see there's still a massive range. So whilst the average for that would be 6.8%, it could be anywhere from 5.8 to 8.8%. So it's really trying to get extra clues to really see where the patient is at. So this comes back to what Toby said, that it's not a one-size-fits-all treatment anymore. And we're really trying to tailor our diabetes treatment to the individual patient. So what works for one person won't work for the person who comes after them, and vice versa. So all of these technologies that I'm going to be talking about will work for some people, they won't work for others. And what is very attractive to one person for a reason that might seem peculiar to someone will be very important to the next person. So we want to make to measured treatment. So luckily, in order to tailor treatment to people, we do have a lot of options. But sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming, like you're navigating the expanses of the universe, and hence the title of my talk. And in fact, if I'd written this talk only 2 months ago, it would have been different. If I write it again in a couple of months' time, it'll be different again. So that's how rapidly this area is changing, which is a good thing, but it means that it's challenging. So what is difficult? It's difficult to keep up because there's new pumps coming out all the time, certainly new meters. So if it's difficult for us who work solely in this area, imagine what it's like for GPs and other health professionals. So it is definitely a challenge to keep up to date with everything that's changing. It's also frustrating and a challenge to try and ensure that there's equitable access to this technology, because for the most part, a lot of this is not funded. So a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight, depends on you having either a spare $10,000 or having, close to top level private health insurance. So we're not at a stage yet where this is something we can roll out to everyone as much as we might like to. So there's inherent frustration in that. And there's ongoing campaigning, obviously, through diabetes organisations like Diabetes SA, NDSS, Diabetes Australia, to try and make that more equitable. And it all takes time. I've put time 3 times because it's very important. And I think both patients and their doctors and health professionals are busier than ever. We're all time poor. And when you look at downloading meters, every meter has a different attachment, everyone has a different USB that has to go into the computer. It's wonderful that we can do these things, but it does take time. So we're in a time poor, particularly in the public health system. So we need to find new ways of getting this to work in a more time-efficient way so that everyone gets what they need from their doctor or from their diabetes educator. Because it's really about achieving outcomes for the patient. So what can technology offer? This is obviously just my opinion. I think it provides a valuable way of integrating diabetes with your everyday life. So whether you're using a health tracker or one of the 50,000 apps now available, it's a way of making diabetes more part of your sort of routine life rather than feeling like it's a disease burden. I think it does create an opportunity for enhanced connectivity between health professionals and their patients, and even between patients. With platforms like CareLink or DiaSend, you can upload data to the cloud and share your diabetes data with your doctor or your nurse even before you go to your appointment. So it does have advantages. There's increased flexibility more so than ever in terms of glucose monitoring options. So we've got flash glucose monitoring, we've got CGMs that don't require finger prick calibrations. It's pretty exciting. And we do have expanded options for treatment delivery or insulin delivery, so pumps, smart pens, and even patches potentially in the future. And I think very importantly for patients and for consumers, it provides, in the case of continuous glucose monitoring, real-time feedback on what your diabetes is doing. Now, that may always not be a good thing. I've seen patients get completely freaked out by knowing what their glucose is doing every minute of the day. And sometimes too much information can be a bad thing. But I think it is valuable to either be reassured or to get that insight into what your glucose is doing at any given point. So, exciting times ahead. Now, I will just put this very brief disclaimer of what technology doesn't replace, because I don't think we can fall into the trap of thinking that these devices or everything that I'm going to be talking about will replace the core aspects of diabetes care. So, a good diabetes educator is worth their weight in gold, and having that good diabetes education will not be replaced by having the latest whiz-bang pump or continuous glucose monitor or meter. I truly believe that having diabetes that you engage with is really about this, the support team that surrounds you first and foremost. It doesn't replace looking at things like blood pressure, weight, getting your eyes checked, getting your feet checked, so all the other things that go along with diabetes care. So it's really just insulin delivery and monitoring. It also doesn't replace actually engaging with your diabetes management. So, you can have a pump, and if you don't use it, it's really only as good as the person attached to the pump. And it's just another tool like anything else, I think. And in the spirit of the theme for World Diabetes Family and Carer Support, it doesn't replace the people that surround you, so the people that love you. Whilst it may provide a platform for you to share your data with your family members, it won't replace the people who ring you at 2 o'clock in the morning to say, are you okay? So these are the things that technology doesn't replace and we still need. Okay, so I'm going to go through blood glucose monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring, insulin pumps, and some of the newer hybrid closed-loop systems, and some other newer insulin delivery devices and some forecasts for the future, time permitting. So, very briefly, you're probably all familiar or have heard of the Abbott Freestyle Libre. Has anyone not heard of this? No one? So this is what's called as flash glucose monitoring. So it doesn't measure blood glucose per se, but interstitial glucose. So that's the interstitial area is around the cells surrounding the blood vessels. So there is a bit of a delay between your interstitial glucose and your actual blood glucose, so it doesn't always reflect accurately what's going on in your blood. But the nice thing about the Freestyle Libre is obviously it's finger prick free. So it's a sensor that you insert on your arm typically for 2 weeks, and you just wave the reader device over the sensor. And you can do that as many times as you like. The sensor here is as shown, but you can also link it with your smartphone. The nice thing about this device is it shows trends, so it will give you an up or a down arrow depending on what your glucose trend is doing. It'll go sideways if you're stable. One of the drawbacks of this device is that it's probably less accurate in the hypoglycemia range, but it will always prompt you to recheck your blood sugar if it comes up with a hypo. The other sad thing about this is that it's not subsidised. So at the moment it's available to people who can pay for it, which is $95 for the reader, and for a fortnight sensor is $93.50 or something like that, $92.50. So it does become expensive. I know some patients who do this in the short term, even for just some short-term insight into what their blood sugars are doing surrounding an event, or if they're doing particular exercise and they want extra information. There are current applications being looked at by the federal government to subsidise this. The last revision was done in August. But there's no decision as yet. But obviously this is something we would like to see greater use of. All right, so that's that's blood glucose monitoring. Now we'll look at CGM and implantable sensors. So continuous glucose monitors are a bit similar to the flash glucose monitoring in that they measure interstitial glucose rather than blood glucose. So the principle is that you attach a sensor to the skin, usually with a little needle going into the interstitial area. And then over the sensor is a transmitter, and then for most CGMs you require a receiver. Now that may be a separate device, or in some cases it's your smartphone. But this is the general way most continuous glucose monitors would function. And we know from studies in the US, and apologies for the US milligrams per decilitre for glucose readings, but we know that use of continuous glucose monitoring does reduce time spent in hypo time. So it's probably, for the most part, useful for trends and for preventing hypos overnight, but more and more we're seeing it in use in things like closed-loop systems as well. So what does it offer for myself when I see a patient who's had continuous glucose monitoring, or for clinicians? It gives us an idea about patterns. So you can see we get a separate line for each day of the week that the person wears this sensor. So this is a health professional sensor, so they would wear it for a week. And you get a breakdown of hypos, high blood sugars, what times of the day they're occurring, and you can pretty quickly start to get a feel for the patterns that someone's glucose is going through. So you can see that the green rectangle is target blood sugars. You can see for the most part overnight they seem to be pretty okay, although they're having some hypos. But during the day they've got very high erratic blood sugars, particularly after meals. And we can use these as tools to modify someone's insulin therapy, or to decide they need to have, more short-acting insulin with their meals, for example, and it's very useful. Alternatively, sometimes it's useful to reassure someone that they're not having hypos if that's a real fear for someone. On top of that, you also get a breakdown of breakfast, lunch and dinner and various points of the day. You do have to calibrate this CGM with finger prick blood sugars while patients are doing it. And we also get them to fill out a food and activity diary while you're doing it for the week. So we get an idea of, okay, this happened because you went to the gym and that's probably why you had that hypo. Because I don't know what about you guys, but I have trouble remembering what I did, 2 weeks ago. So without writing it down, it becomes very difficult to piece together the patterns. So we get them to log everything they do, and then we can tease out some of the ways we can fix things. So it's very useful for us. So what does it offer for the patient with diabetes? So these are for patients who are wearing continuous glucose monitors for most of the time, which is funded in a paediatric setting by NDSS for people less than 21 years. But not yet funded for adults, unfortunately. I think it offers peace of mind, because if you combine it with pumps, you can actually suspend your insulin delivery if you're having a hypo. So I've had a lot of patients who say they've slept soundly for the first time in years because they know their continuous glucose monitor will alarm or tell them if they're having a low. It offers hypoglycemic safety, so they actually can be programmed to suspend your pump, and even to suspend before you go low if the pump if the continuous glucose monitor senses that you're trending low, it will actually switch it off and give you a bit of an alert. It gives you real-time feedback on your glucose trends. So if you're, going for a run, you can watch what your blood sugar's doing and, observe that pattern for next time and, maybe put in a new temporary basal for your pump next time you go to do the same activity. So it's a learning activity as well. And in some of the newer pumps, the combination of the pump plus continuous glucose monitor allows for what's called a hybrid closed loop, which I will go into more detail about later. Okay, so the current CGM systems available to patients for private use in Australia are predominantly Dexcom and Guardian. So Dexcom is distributed by AMSL, and you would have seen their little station out the front. The Dexcom G4 is still around, but most people are using Dexcom G5 now, which is doesn't require a receiver. It's compatible with both iPhone and the Apple Watch, as with everything in life. It does also work with the new tandem T-Slim X2 pump, which you'll hear about a little bit later as well. The G4 Platinum is still available, and some people can use that with the Animas Vibe, but it doesn't do low suspend. The Guardian 2 is the main sensor and CGM being used with the Medtronic 640G, which I will talk about later as well. The Mini-Link and the Guardian Connect are also available. So the Guardian Connect is a CGM mainly marketed towards people on multiple daily injections of insulin rather than pumps. So it works to talk to your phone and tell you sort of patterns in what your glucose is doing, and sometimes it can even prompt you to give yourself extra insulin if you need. The ones we use for healthcare professionals or people coming to clinic are slightly different in that, for the most part, the CGM is blinded to the patient while the patient is wearing it. So for the week that they wear the continuous glucose monitor before coming back to see us in clinic, they don't necessarily know what's going on with the glucose with the device. It's not until we pull it off the tummy and click it into the computer and download the data that we get that printout that you saw earlier. Whereas the personal continuous glucose monitors will actually show up on your phone with real-time feedback on what your glucose is doing. Some of the future things in the pipeline, which should be coming, in the next months, are Dexcom G6 and Guardian 3. So these are important because they will provide some links with the pumps that are coming out in terms of new functionality. So the Dexcom G6 is a thinner, smaller version of the G5. It doesn't require necessarily any finger prick calibrations in terms of its current marketing in the US. It will communicate with smartwatches and Fitbit. And the plan is that it will link with the tandem T-Slim X2 pump to provide what's called basal IQ, which is essentially the equivalent of what is happening with the Medtronic 640G pump at the moment, which basically, if you wear the CGM and your pump, and the CGM senses that your glucose is going low or about to go low, it'll tell your pump to switch off. Switch off your basal supply for 2.5 hours to allow your glucose to come back up. So that will be involved with the Dexcom G6 and the tandem pump, and that's in the pipeline, probably sometime next year. The Guardian 3 sensor is not yet approved in Australia, but once it is, it will allow use with the new Medtronic 670G pump, and again, I'll go into the pumps in more detail a bit later on, to allow the first commercial hybrid closed loop in Australia. And we think that'll probably be early next year. There are also these longer-term implantable sensors, which are in use either in US or Europe. So this is a company called Senseonics, which made a 90-day implantable sensor. So it goes in your arm for 3 months. And then you put a little transmitter over the top, and then your smartphone app will receive the information. Now, you can take the transmitter off at any stage if you want to stop receiving information. And people have, blinged them up with stickers and things to make it look a bit more attractive. So that's approved in the US as of June of this year, and it's been approved in Europe for the last 2 years. It's not yet in use in Australia, but hopefully in the future. And even smaller again, which is proposed to come out sort of in the US and Europe maybe next year as a collaboration between Dexcom and a company called Verily. To give you an idea, the bottom sensor is the size of an M&M. So we're talking very, very small, almost peel it off type size that you wear for 2 weeks and you barely notice it's there, which when you compare to the big continuous glucose monitors that we've traditionally been using that look like a big spaceship on your abdomen, this is preferable. So things are happening all the time and it's a very exciting area. So insulin pumps and hybrid closed loops. So everyone would be pretty familiar with the current iteration of pumps that we have these days, but they used to be pretty unwieldy things that you would never wish on your worst enemy. The first one made back in the 60s was one made by a doctor that he wore almost like a backpack. So the whole of his back was basically taken up by insulin pump. Not really practical and not really suitable with a bathing suit. So the ones we've got now are far preferable. We've come a long way. So this is the list of pumps currently available in Australia, to my knowledge. Now, this might have changed in the last 48 hours for all I know. But the ones in bold are the ones that have been released in the last 12 months. So you can see that this is rapidly expanding and changing. So we actually went from only a pretty narrow pump market only 12 months ago to having this explosion of new pumps in the last year. So this is why this is very timely, and I'll do my best to give you a bit of a summary of all of these options. So, Medtronic. So the 640, and this is in no particular order except that this is probably the most common pump in use at the moment. So the 640G or the MiniMed 640G is the main pump that's been for sale, at least for new pumps by Medtronic for the last couple of years, last 3 or 4 years really. And it can either be used as a standalone pump without continuous glucose monitoring or with the Guardian 2 CGM. If you use it with a continuous glucose monitor, it has what's called SmartGuard technology, which means it will suspend your basal insulin supply or delivery on a hypo event or just before a hypo event. It links with Bluetooth to the meter that is supplied with the pump. So if you're using the meter that is supplied, then you don't have to manually enter blood glucoses. There is still the option to manually enter them if you're using an alternative meter and you don't like the Contour one. It's AA battery powered. And you upload your data to CareLink to share your pump downloads, etc. with your clinician or your family members or whoever. So that's the 640G. And that's been available for a few years now. The 670G is one that has really just emerged in Australia anyway, in the last month or so. So it received TGA approval in Australia, which means that the company can talk about it. And it's exciting because once we get the sensors, the Guardian 3 sensors approved in Australia, this will be the first commercial hybrid closed loop available in Australia, in all likelihood. At the moment, the sensors aren't approved, so essentially it's functioning as a standalone pump only if someone does get a 670G, which is possible as of the last week. They have stock in Australia and they are starting to supply them to patients who need upgrades. They anticipate that the Guardian 3 sensors will be available hopefully from either the end of this year or early next year, so it is very close. And when I say hybrid closed loop, I will explain that a little bit in further detail, but it basically means that not only does the pump talk to the CGM and the pump switches off if your blood sugar is low, but it will automatically calibrate your basal insulin according to keeping your blood sugar in target range. So it won't do your boluses, but it will adjust your basal according to what your blood sugar is, either higher or lower, to keep you at the set target. So it's starting to be a move towards, the idea of an artificial pancreas. There are trials in Australia using these 670Gs currently ongoing. In Melbourne and Adelaide has a couple of sites as well. I've sort of got some feedback from some of the patients who've used them. If anyone wants to ask me afterwards, I probably don't have time right now, but it's very exciting. So that's the 670G. Then we've got the Tandem T-Slim X2, which has recently come across to Australia. It's been available in the US for some time, so we've had it for the last couple of months. Now, the nice thing about this pump is that it's rechargeable. It is sort of smartphone-like in that it has a touch screen, so it's very attractive to the younger subset who like to have a device that is a bit more responsive than the clunkier old pumps. It's got a pretty robust aluminium case. I've seen the rep throw it across the room and it hasn't been dented, and it's pretty waterproof as well. It's been rolled out by AMSL as the company, and they're also rolling them out to people who are currently Animas Vibe users, because Animas is withdrawing from the market. So as people go out of warranty for the Animas Vibe, they'll generally be replaced with this pump if they want to stay with the same company. The other nice thing about this pump is that you can actually update the software or the pump via USB rather than actually having to get a whole new pump to get new software or new changes. So what they're marketing it as a pump that gets updated in perpetuity rather than having to get a new physical pump. The updates that will be important for this are the Basal IQ and the Control IQ. So Basal IQ is essentially the same as the Smart Guard technology on the Medtronic 640G that we have already, in that it will suspend on lows if you use it with the Dexcom G6 sensor. Again, not yet available in Australia. The Control IQ, which is currently in trials in the US, so is a way off for us, will be like the hybrid closed loop, in that will auto-adjust the basal according to your blood sugar. So other companies are doing the same thing as Medtronic, it's just a little bit further off. The ACCU-Chek Roche pump, the Spirit Combo, has been around for a while. It's probably arguably has fewer users, but it's useful for people who don't want to have to get their pump out to do boluses, who want to just leave it in their pocket, because the receiver actually acts as like a remote control. So you can just have the little remote control in your handbag or your pocket and pull that out rather than having to fiddle with the pump that's attached to you. So some people like that. And particularly useful for parents with kids. It means they can chase the kid around with the remote rather than having to actually grab the kid and get the pump. It's not currently compatible with CGMS to provide auto suspends for hypos like the other pumps, but it's pretty hardy, and again, you can chuck it around and not much will happen to it. It is a pump that I'll go into a little bit more detail for some of the open protocol hybrid closed loops. The Cell Novo has been available since late last year, but they did a small initial rollout to consumers deliberately, like only to a very specified number according to the reps, because they wanted to see how it would go in the first 12 months, get initial consumer feedback and then make modifications. So they've just reached the end of that feedback cycle and they've updated the handset which goes with it, and they will be rolling it out to more people. I don't think there's many patients on these yet, but we'll probably see them more because this is quite an attractive, tiny little pump. It has a small area of tubing, so it's easy to hide away. And the nice thing about this pump is it comes with the dedicated handset, which basically controls all the functions of the pump. So again, you can have the pump hidden somewhere and control it with your handset. It includes an activity diary and a food diary, and it's a bit like having a smartphone built to control your pump. It's not currently compatible with smartphones, so you can't get an app on your phone that'll talk to this pump. You have to use their dedicated handset, and they've done that quite deliberately because they don't want interference. But you know, it's an attractive option if you want something very discreet. The Ipso pump from Ipso Med. I've not seen anyone on this yet. Anyone using it in the audience? No? Available for the last 6 months or so. It's also a tiny little pump, about this big, and it communicates via Bluetooth to an app on your phone. You control it using the app. So you can see the theme is all these new pumps are either Bluetooth or radio frequency linking with some sort of device, which basically limits the amount that you have to fiddle with the pump itself, and it also means they can make the pump itself much smaller. So the pump really is just attached to your skin to control and hold the insulin, and then the smartphone or whatever device you're using is how you do your boluses, etc. So that seems to be the theme in what we're seeing now. This pump is not currently for sale in Australia, but it is on the prosthesis list, so theoretically someone could buy it from overseas and use it here, and the consumables are available through the NDSS, but it's a company that's really not selling the pump in Australia as yet, so I won't go into detail on that. So probably you're all interested in the closed loop or hybrid closed loop systems, and this is sort of how they work. So there's 3 different types. So the open loop is what we're familiar with in terms of your standard pump, that you can have a sensor, you have a pump, they talk to each other, but the pump doesn't change anything based on the CGM. They just coexist. And you still have to deliver your boluses manually, and you're really doing all the work yourself. The hybrid closed loop is what will be available with the 670G once the Guardian 3 sensors are available, in that it will auto-adjust your basal, but you'll still have to do manual boluses. So you still have to tell your pump what you're eating. You still have to occasionally check blood sugar, but it will auto-adjust your basal according to what your blood sugar is to try and keep you in range. And then the ultimate goal is the closed loop system, which we don't have yet and is still experimental, which does everything for you. So it senses your glucose, it talks to the pump, it adjusts your basal, and it gives you automatic boluses if it senses that you're eating based on a blood sugar rise. We're not there yet, it's in trials. So this is where we are now, which is on the precipice of having in Australia the first hybrid closed loop system with the 670G, and certainly there are patients who are in clinical trials with this already. We've got a little way to go until we get to the fully automated area. So when we talk about a hybrid closed loop system, there are certain components that are necessary. You have to have the insulin delivery device, obviously the pump. You have to have a blood glucose meter. You have to have a CGMS glucose sensor plus the transmitter, and you need computer software for analysis. So that's an algorithm of some description. There are 3 main types, which I won't go into because the maths make my brain go strange. But it basically analyses the patterns in your glucose and tells the pump what to do. So the CGMS talks to the computer software, and then it tells your pump whether to go up or down. And there are 7 adult sites and 5 paediatric sites that are doing clinical trials with this device at the moment with the Medtronic. I think the greatest benefit they've seen in their early 6-month results has been to overnight blood sugars. So most people will wake up with really nice blood sugars with this device. It probably doesn't cope as well with the big changes during the day. So it struggles with exercise, it struggles a little bit with meals. And some people find that they prefer to be able to dictate to the pump exactly what they get in terms of basal or temporary basal during the day, which this doesn't allow you to do. Once you're in the auto mode will adjust your basal according to what it thinks you need. So if you want to do a temporary basal because you know you're going for a run, or you know that you're on your period or something like that and you need more insulin, then you have to exit the hybrid closed loop system or go out of the auto mode and do it yourself manually. So you still are able to do that, but it doesn't quite have that fine-tuning capability that you would have interacting with your pump yourself. So this is what a download report looks like for a hybrid closed loop pump. Across the bottom in the pink is the basal rates, and you can see it changes all the time according to what the blood sugar is. The green line across the report is the target blood sugar, and you can see that there's still, quite large variations in blood sugar for this patient. I think the main thing is that for this particular pump, it corrects to a target of about 6.6 millimoles or 6.7 millimoles per litre, which is preset by Medtronic, by the company. So you can't change that. You can do a temporary one for exercise where it corrects to 8.3, so you don't get hypoalarms while you're exercising, but that will only allow you to do that for a certain amount of time. So there is some restrictions to what you can do. But in principle, it's pretty cool. So I'm just going to briefly mention, so the ones I've been talking about so far, the Medtronic 670G and the future Tandem one, they're what's known as closed protocol hybrid closed loops, i.e. they're proprietary algorithms owned by the companies, and they're commercially marketed, TGA approved, etc. There is a community in Australia, which I will mention but can't advocate or detract from, who call themselves #WeAreNotWaiting, that have created their own hybrid closed loop systems by getting their pumps to talk to the CGM themselves. And this is a movement that started in the US. There's about 400 Facebook members in Australia who subscribe to this, and there's probably about 100 to 200 current people in Australia who are creating their own loop systems. So it's just, I put it on here mainly because as clinicians and as people working in diabetes, we have to be aware that some people are doing this. and not to be completely frightened off. Because some people were growing frustrated with the wait for the companies to catch up, so they've basically done it themselves. But the good news is that companies are almost there. So I'm just going to very quickly in my last 5 minutes go over some of the newer developments for other insulin delivery devices. So that was pumps. These are smart pens. So obviously people who are not on pumps are still having to use pens to inject. So these smart pens are somewhat similar to a smart meter in that they talk via Bluetooth to a platform that has your insulin carb ratio or your insulin sensitivity factor programmed. You can also set them to remind you when you're due for your next insulin. It'll tell you how much insulin on board you have, when your last dose was. The main brands are the ones I've got here. They're not available in Australia yet, but hopefully soon. And they're being marketed in Europe and the US. And then this is, not strictly speaking, a type 1 product, but I thought it did belong in the technology talk. So this is being marketed for type 2 patients. And it's a little mechanical pump which has just been released by AMSL recently, where you pre-fill it with a set amount of insulin, and it basically gives you a constant amount of basal over a 24-hour period, and you can click it to give yourself boluses in 2-unit increments. So it's not ideal for the patient who's on a lot of insulin, because the maximum you can have in this is 40 units of basal plus 36 units of bolus, so 76 units in a day, which for some people sounds like a lot, but for some people it's only a tiny bit. So this would be, quite select type 2 patients, but it is out there and it is available. And what do I think is coming in the future? So there's a whole lot of things in the US that are being developed that we will probably eventually get. There's a company called Bigfoot Biomedical, which are creating an integrated diabetes ecosystem where they make everything except the insulin, etc. essentially. So they make the pens, they make the pumps, they can set reminders to send you to deliver your supplies to your house. It's almost like a one-stop shop for diabetes. The other thing that's being looked at is like a closed-loop system or pump that not only has insulin in it but also infuses glucagon. You would know glucagon is the hormone that is released in response to having a hypo. Most patients with type 1 don't have good glucagon responses to hypoglycemia. So the theory is by infusing both insulin and glucagon in the same pump, you can not only control the highs but also the lows a bit better. There are issues with this because glucagon is less stable in terms of putting it in cartridges, so it's still experimental and being developed in the US. There's a US company that's making insulin patches, which is like a little sort of 50-cent piece with hundreds of little tiny nano needles on it that you place on your skin, and it delivers insulin over a 24-hour period. They're looking to be available in the US in, say, a year. And then other people are developing nanotechnology, so little pellets that can be inserted under your skin, which gradually release insulin into the bloodstream. So that's pretty cool. And then I've put question marks because who knows what will happen next. So my final thoughts, technology is changing all the time. It's important to keep up where we can. More and more patients are using pumps and continuous glucose monitors, and I think we should be doing everything we can to make this more available to the general public as well, because I think it's one of the deepest, most unfair things in diabetes care that I encounter as a doctor is not being able to offer some of these to everyone that comes into clinic. And it seems like a deeply unfair system to me. But that's what we're stuck with, and we'll do our best while we can. I think, as with anything in diabetes care, we have to think about the individual and what's going to suit them. So putting, a 95-year-old person on a pump is probably not going to be the most sensible thing if, a smartphone is not something she's grown up with. But in the generation of people, being attached to their devices, we're going to get more and more of these that look like phones. So I think it's steps in the right direction. And that's it. Didn't go too much over time.